bachelor's in engineering from College of Engineering, Trivandrum, and his master's in business studies from his MBA from XIMT, Bhubaneswar. So, and he has had 18 years of experience with ad agencies, and he has worked around human-centered design. And currently, he is the chief evangelist of Fractal Designs, and he's the chairman of Final Mile Consulting. So he Fractal currently works majorly around AI, design, and engineering, and it's an amalgamation of all these three things that it works. And it's it's on the topmost research agencies in the world. And Biju's expertise goes from human behavior to cognitive neuroscience to behavioral economics. I would not be taking much time because I have been attending his classes and I know how insightful it is. So over to you, Biju, and hope we have a great session. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. I was having a chat with some of you, and Praveen, I know him for a long time. I think last few years I've been coming to NID whenever we come, and so it's a privilege always to speak to.
And also a lot of graduates have worked with you, Biju.
Yeah, I know. Lots of. I think you and I know all of the Praveen students, but they won't even know. They go back to such a long time. I know she introduced me as 18 years. No, I've been working for 30 years. So a lot of NID graduates from you talk about it from those days. They've been working with me. 18 years have been advertising. The last 14 years has been completely outside advertising. Okay, so I'm going to speak about something called brain intelligence. It's a new term that I created last night. So let me explain what it is. I think, when I'm looking at, when we talk about design, I know this is the word you would have heard the most about, saying that it's humans should be at the center of it. You should understand the human beings are there and all of it. As she mentioned, first 18 years I was in advertising. We used to look at human beings and really try to understand it. But I think one of the things I realized in the first 18 years is that we're doing a pathetic job of it, because human behavior is very, very, very complex. And our research methodologies, our approach of 30-second commercials, or whatever we designers and all of us, what we were trying to do, we were doing a pathetic job. And I think that's why I got out of advertising and I co-founded Final Mile in 2007, was with a clear objective to re-look at this whole facet of persuasion and design in a new way. And I did tell your colleagues who listen to me, so you will feel, and you will feel that anger that I have towards my first 18 years of my life. And so don't get hurt by it. It's just that anger that keeps me going, which is allowing me to read every day about human behavior. So I know that I'm still far, far, far away from trying to still say that I've got a grip on this thing called human behavior. But that feeling of inadequacy is what keeps me going every day. So let me look at some of the new learnings that I picked up in terms of how we deal with it. For example, there is this person by name Gerd Grenzer from Max Planck Institute. He's someone I know, someone I work with, and I know him, a potential Nobel Prize winner. He's got a few, and I would one of the books that he has, it's there in something called Gut Feelings. It's a book that changed my life somewhere in 2000s when I was looking for this new way of looking at human behavior. And therein Gerd looks at it and says, there is a high ball that's coming in. Now, how does a person decides to catch? I know none of you were born when Kapil Dev took this particular catch, which almost helped us win the 1983 World Cup. When this is the catch against Vivian Richards, he was running backwards and in a high catch, and finally he takes that catch. It's there. Now, if you really look at it, then from a rational point of view, the number of variables that are involved for him to judge what is the trajectory of this particular ball. So where should I be? So it's basically he has to figure out what is the way, the force at which this ball was hit. Now, what is the wind velocity? What is the direction of it? There are so many factors that are involved there. And then at what speed should I run? Now, Gerd has figured out that the human brain does not have none of these variables. Even if I give all these information to you and then convert it into parabolic equations and whatever equations and all that, and then to calculate and then figure out, okay, where should I be? Sorry, the ball would have fallen down and you will be still sitting somewhere in the classroom trying to figure out. But the brain is much, much smarter than what we think. Now, what does the brain do? Does the brain take all these factors into consideration? No, the brain takes only one parameter into consideration, and Gerd calls it smart heuristics. Now, what is the smart heuristics in this particular case? Oops. The brain is just looking at the angle between me and the ball. It's called the gaze angle. And all that the brain tries to do is to maintain the angle as a constant level. So I run fast, I run slow, this one there, I do it, and then I'm there under the ball to catch it. Of course, catching is a different action in itself, but making sure that you get the trajectory of the ball perfectly and then be under that is based on one parameter, one smart heuristics the brain takes. And that heuristics is what is allowing him to take an extremely difficult decision involving whole data, but in an extremely smart way. Or you are, designers. Now you tell me concave and convex how to draw. Biju, come on, yeah. Don't teach a squirrel how to climb a tree. Okay, I'm not teaching you what to do. But you know how to create a concave and convex. It's all about the shading that happens around there. But what is the rule behind it? Is there a deeper rule behind it which is governing it all? And I was telling the few of the colleagues who were listening to me yesterday and today, behind everything there is the deeper rule. And once you understand the deeper rules, you suddenly realize that, oh, I can figure out and I can do things better. Now, if you see both are the same, actually one is looking convex here, the other is looking concave. There's nothing but I've just changed to ultify and suddenly looking different. So how can it be? It's because obviously the shading that you actually see. Now that feeling that one is concave and the other is convex is actually based on a fundamental rule that is written in the brain. You know what the rule is? That rule says, there's only one source of light, and that source of light comes from top. That is the rule that allows you to shade there or, those particular things. So yeah, the person who teaches you, the design might not have taught you this, but the design of where to draw a shade and where to actually lighten it and where to darken it is based on a fundamental rule that's written in the brain. Now, this rule is wrong by all standards today, which is the last 150 years or so, light is there in my room now for all angles. But as I said, there is a thing called the human brain that has been around for millions of years. It has certain rules. And the more you understand those rules is where you start understanding these things that are happening around there. Or the biggest cause of death in Mumbai city is people cross the railway tracks and they get hit by a train. And railway came to us and said, we have no clue. Why should they get hit by a train that they can see coming in? Now, when my team went in, they realized it is a problem with our brain. Our brain evolutionarily is good in judging the speed of small things because they've seen rabbits and deers running far, whatever. They could gauge the speed of that, throw a stone or a spear and kill it and have their breakfast that particular day. Elephants and giraffes never moved fast. So human brain started seeing large objects move fast the last 100, 150 years, 200 years. 200 years is too short a time in the million-year construction of the brain to make any impact. So when a large object like the train is coming in, we are underestimating the speed of that by close to 40%. So I see the train and I start walking in, thinking, oh, I can cross. By then the train comes in, but in no time, the train is much closer than what it does. Poof, I get hit by it. So the problem itself is in the brain. Now, how do we solve it? The traditional solution is what we have done. Automotive, brilliant engineers, whoever designed the cars, they think, oh, we know how to get the people to also manage some of the problems. People might turn right and, there will be a motorcycle. So they wrote objects in the mirror are closer than what they appear. Now, based on the same logic, people could have put up boards across Bombay by saying trains are faster than what do you think, so be careful. Now, this is what we call communication to the conscious mind. And the brain, when you go into the brain, you realize 99.99% of the processing of the brain happens at a non-conscious level. So the traditional approach to design where you're speaking to the conscious mind is a very, very, very ineffective way of communicating. So my design team decided to get into the deeper constructs of how does the brain judge speed, because there is a misjudgment of speed. And suddenly we came across this rule, basically said the brain always judges speed with respect to a reference point. If there's no reference point, as it happens when you're on a flight, you can't judge the speed. So if we have to get the people to judge the speed, now give them a reference point. So the places in Bombay where people cross are constant. So what did the team do? They said, let's give a reference point. How do we get a reference point? They said, let's run obviously on the track. Now, so they said, leave 5 sleepers empty in the direction of the train. 5 sleepers are painted in yellow. 15 are left empty. Another 5 are painted. 15 are left empty. After some time, there's a convergence happen. So you have a blobs of about 5 yellows. That's all. The speed, when the train comes from there, the speed at which these yellow blobs disappear under the train becomes a reference for these people. Now, the interesting thing is you ask people where this has been tried, like Wadala, we have tried and we have seen accidents come down by 75%. What are the yellow lines of? Sir, malum nahi hai, sir. I have no idea. Normally where, on the roads where we cross that line, this is, I think, for the motormen. I don't know. That means we have impacted their life without they actually knowing about it. Now, we took the same reference and I was explaining that to the team. Now, this is how to reduce road accidents in India. And this is Hyderabad-Bangalore highway. Now, we want the person, we know that's the accident spot ahead. We should want to get the person to slow down. Now, traditional solution is slow down, accident, danger ahead. None of it will work. But the team figured out that the people actually judge what's, that the leg should be in the accelerator or on the brake is not by looking at the speedometer, by how things are going past them. Now, once we got that insight, we said, oh, let's play a trick on that. So there are white lines drawn out there. And now the distance between these white lines have been purposely been reduced as it approaches. Now, what it does to you, the white lines are moving. Suddenly the white lines are moving much faster, automatically. And our speed gun studies before and after the solution was introduced, we found people had 38% to 50% reduction in speed. And we obviously ended up having almost 70% reduction in accidents across 14 highways in this country. But the other is, as a good Catholic boy, at least that's what my wife thinks I am, I'm not. But one thing I know, I look at the religion with a lot of respect, because to me, whatever they do, they're doing it with a lot of purpose. And there's a lot of science behind what they do. And one of the things I realized as a good Catholic boy, and it's true for every religion, repetition is an integral part of what a religion does. And I realized that means if I can repeat things, the brain loves it and things would actually be better. So what did we do? Now for the same road, this one there, we created a poster, and this is what traditionally we would have done, but we made the poster in not just one image, we made the image into 3. Purposely to create a multiplicity or the repetition around it. Now you might ask, oh, why did we do 3? Now I come from Kerala, and my whole student days and others, I've heard one thing, Inkulab, Inkulab, Inkulab Zindabad. Now I looked at it very closely and realized they don't say it twice, they don't say it 4 times. They say only 3 times. But I also, as I said, looked back into my own religion. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I looked at the Hindu religion, Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma. There is a construct of a 3. Look at the Olympic slogan. There is a huge power behind it from a very design point of view. And I realized we don't have to, when I'm repeating it, I don't have to repeat something twice. I don't have to repeat it 4 times, but the ideal construct from a design point of view, repetition is actually 3. Now, In that case, it was actually on the poster. Now, this is where we were asked by the railways to manage their biggest issue, road cause of accident, which is accidents at unmanned level crossings. Now, here what we have done it from is from a repetition of 3, but it's actually not on the same, but it's ahead. So at 20 meters, at 10 meters, and 5 meters. And now you also see that the images are not the same. It is actually as if the accident, the first image shows as if the train is about 100 meters away from you or slightly. But at that point of time, for him to meet with an accident, the train will be about 300 meters away from you. Assume this guy ignores that and still continues moving forward. And then it shows the train is about 5 meters away from you. At that point of time, the train will be about 50 meters away from you. He still ignores it. He still moves forward. Now, at this point of time, the train is about 30 meters away from you. But this shows as if the train has hit you. Now, how dare you go? We actually created an injections of fear. Remember, fear is actually one of the most powerful emotions. Emotion itself is brilliant, but fear, the emotion of fear has saved far more human lives than even modern medicine. So here is a case of fear being used, what we call injections of fear being used in our posters, in our signage system to actually get the people to behave properly. We did the same thing in roads, and we done it. Okay. The other point I know immediately you will ask is, Biju, does people get used to this? And I think one of the things, again, we looked at the brain, always look at the brain and understand what are something called the permanent fears. Now, fear of a large object is one of those evolutionary fears that don't go away. So I think one of the reasons why we took as it's a large object like a train, we knew will always be a permanent figure. It's like a fear of a snake. Even if I show you a picture of a snake, unless you're someone who played with a snake for a long time, even when you see a picture of a snake, you will actually move back. That's exactly we do to make sure that, because you do it, people don't get used to it. That used to be a problem with advertising, which is people used to get used to in advertising. But here, later, I think, when another thing was we did try this, solution. For 6 months, we saw accident rates coming down from 23 to 9. And initially, I didn't know whether things would work. So next 6 months, we put it up again, and the accidents came to 1. So these solutions that I'm speaking about actually becomes more powerful as the time passes by. The other brain intelligence that we found is, I know many times in cigarette advertising and others, people say, show death. Now, when you go deep into neuroscience, one of the things they teach you is the brain always denies our death. First of all, even in our dreams, our brains don't have experience of our death. When you're falling down from the top of a cliff or whatever in our dreams, before we hit the ground, we'll wake up. So every time you show death, cigarette packs and others and all, they've done it, is always you. That's where people still hold that pack and they still smoke, because death is someone else's, is not me. But we knew one thing, the fear of you being about to be hit by a train, a lot of people have got that fear still in their minds. That fear is what we've actually depicted out here. So we purposely didn't show a dead body lying on the track or whatever. It's because the neuroscience told us there is nothing, there's denial of death. Because denial of, if I think I'm going to die in next 1 hour's time, this talk won't happen. Because I would want to sit with my wife and my child and spend my next 1 hour in this earth. I won't reproduce, nothing will happen. That's why purposely our brain blocks the fact that I might die next 1 hour or I might die tomorrow. I think once we understand that neurological fact, the way you create fear then becomes in a different way. You design fear will actually be in a different way. And one other thing, again, from a neuroscience point of view, is these emotions are important, like emotions of fear. But we realized it is best communicated through, say, if I'm sitting here, if I do this, the fear that I had, that as if there was something that went past, it's almost got transferred onto you because something called mirror neurons. Now, mirror neurons, your mirror neurons that were looking at my face captured that fear and absorbed it into your brain. That happens ideally in face-to-face interaction. But obviously, we can't. The next best option was to have a photograph. So for the first time in a signage system in the world, my design team actually said, let's have photographs. And so we had photographs. And we also realized the best place to communicate that is not when I'm sitting in the living room, when I'm just about to do the behavior that I'm not supposed to do. That means the intervention is at the point of action. That means the design intervention we have created is at the point of action and not at anywhere else. So here, and which is again fundamentally different from so far what we have designed is always mostly on things that are far away, brochures, 30-second commercials that happen out there. No, that's not the way to do it. The brain says, because brain also has something called forgetting. Forgetting, remember, forgetting is actually one of the most efficient mechanisms of the brain. So whatever you see in the living room, you think, yeah, I will drive slowly and I will do that. You might say a lot of things, but in no time, almost 70% of what you've seen is forgotten in the first 1 hour. So the best way to make sure people don't forget is to put the stimuli, the design stimuli, at the point of action. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is, for example, brain. For example, government of India told us we built toilets, people are not using the toilets. Can you guys find a design solution and come up with how to get them to improve the usage of the toilets? So my team went. This is rural Karnataka. So we had taken 2 villages and we studied. So they went to all this and they started chatting and all that. So one of the things that people said is, sir, inside it takes a very long time, sir. Whereas outside, I can, and it happens very fast. Now you might just wonder and say, come on here, same act of defecation, how can it take a longer time here and then the outside it happens fast? But remember, don't ever, sort of dismiss anything with the consumer says. There'll always be a deeper reason as to why he's saying it. They also said, no, sir, there it was like, now we're cooking, our kitchen is close by. No, I don't want this and that, sir. How can it be? He came up with lots of reasons, lots of reasons. And we could see that he's just not relating to the space at all. So he had enough and more reasons as to why, yes, government gave us money, we this and that, we built it, but we're not going to use it. Now, what did the team do? When we looked at as to why people are saying, it's taking a long time, the people went into the neuroscience of it. They said, oh, they went inside. They realized no light is entering that place. Now, brain judges passage of time always with respect to sunlight. And there's something called a circadian clock in our brain. And that is capturing the passage of time always with respect to the passage of sunlight. And if you're in a room, for example, with no sunlight entering and there is a static light across there, it just completely screws up I'm sorry to use the word, your whole system. Because otherwise the circadian clock says 8 o'clock, have breakfast. And then you go to the office. Suddenly you listen, okay, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, slowly feel hungry, 1 o'clock. Okay, sir, let's have lunch. So there is a way in which your circadian clock is telling your digestive system to actually, now if there is no light coming in, and there's a constant light that happens around there, what happens is suddenly the meeting, and then you look up, oops, it's 2 o'clock. And suddenly you tell your digestive system to now start interact. It doesn't work. Now, when you go to some of those old offices where there was no windows and other things, you also might have seen one of those large clocks being there. A lot of people will say, clock, man, I think these guys want to always look at time and all that. And, these are lazy guys. That's why I have a clock. Today, when I see this, I tell them, I think there was an intuitive wisdom of those people who kept a clock because they knew there's no sunlight entering. I mean, their circadian clock is not picking up any this or passage of time. But when there's a large clock in the room, they can actually see the time passage and they're able to get their productivity right about it. So in this case, what my team did was she actually said, let's cut a window. And for the ladies, obviously privacy, let's put a screen out there. And then we said, okay, the same color as the house, in order to create, we said, get them to paint it. We said, no, no, the paint that, sir, is lying there, take it. Now, it was to create an acceptability of a connection between the home and the house by actually, having the same color. The name is also written out there. And then we said, there is, again, a brain principle, behavioral science principle would say, if people take effort to do something, the relationship to that actually goes up. So we told them to buy certain plants, put it up outside. So it wasn't a dirty place and something that I should forget. It is something we created ways to create a relationship with this particular place across there. And that is how we got, get the people to use these toilets more often. Or another brain principle says there's that, and again, unmanned level crossing. So we realized that wherever unmanned level crossing accidents were happening, we studied, went to almost all the accident spots, and we realized one thing: visibility was not the problem. For that matter, we realized wherever the visibility of the train is good, accidents will happen. Wherever the visibility is poor because of a tree or a mountain or whatever, those unmanned spots, no accidents will happen. And the people who meet with accidents are not people who are traveling there for the first time. They're all people who are actually, travel, across this track at least 10 times, every day. And for years, they've been doing it. So they know, oh, that is, Jaipur local coming. And there is that whole need for me to compete with that guy and cross. Not that he wants to cross the other side and he's got some humongous job to happen. He just doesn't want to stop for the train and just want to stop for 30 seconds to do that. So he's trying to compete with that particular train. So he's seeing the train very clearly. Then we said, now this idiot, to get him into that mode of it, we have to increase the task difficulty of reaching that particular track. And the government of India anyway had said there has to be 2 speed breakers. But my design team did one more thing. You know what we did? They actually turned the first speed breaker by an angle of 21 degrees. Because data really showed us that the people who meet with accidents are all 4-wheeler people. Now, what this 21 degrees does to you is, otherwise, tuck is what happens. Now, once 21 degrees, what happens is tuck. It's completely an unusual feeling that happens to you. And purposely we said, yes, let's create that task difficulty. Let's create an unusual experience to him when he's trying to take on an accident. So create that feeling of difficulty, which would accentuate the feeling of risk that could happen. You saw the posters that we had before. So along with that posters, obviously that was adding fear. We also increase the task difficulty so that we said, okay, now let him get into a cautionary note and let him allow that train to pass by. Or the sorry, I don't know how to go back. Yeah, the other is, for example, brain obviously has, from a sound point of view. One of the interesting things we found from the intelligence and interesting facet about the brain was that our ears listen to a sound, not when the sound is loud, but when there's a gap between 2 sounds. So railway horn until recently has been on. Now, based on this study, what we told the railways is, I know what you have normally is, we actually told the railways, actually change your horn to staccato horns. And if you see in the last few years, based on a recommendation, Indian Railway has actually told the loco pilots, what was your oh? Now it's actually oh, because that little gap between it actually improves the attention that people provide to that particular horn. Now just see. So what we have done is, these are all rules that are written in the brain. Once we knew that, all that we had to do was tell the creative team, hey, creative team, here is, say, audio. If I think, this is what we can do. Okay. And I'm sure his almost answer is there. Okay. Then horn is right now is continuous. And by adding a staccato, would that principle work? Yeah. Let's try it. Let's work it across there. So far I spoke about the brain. And the belief was that intelligence is all residing in the brain. And and the interesting thing about the brain is that brain is something that has been now, by developing over last 600 million years. And over the last 600 million years, the brain has created certain sets of rules, within that. So the point I was trying to say so far has been, the more you understand those rules that are written in the brain, and then take it into and convert and put it into, and then make design artifacts based on those, then those interventions seems to be very, very interesting. Yes, purposely, I know when you design understanding humans, we tend to look at humans, we tend to look at trends. So torn jeans, something else, and you design things. Yeah, you can. I'm not denying it. You can actually come down to something, a level of culture. Now, culture is something that has evolved in the last 50,000 years. Now, all I'm exhorting you is there is something called the brain that has been evolving in the last 600 million years. And I think there is something deep in that. And if you can capture that, I have no doubt, as I showed you, and as a across design projects that we've done, things can be brilliant. But the last, this one, I also realized, and it's all this was now the belief that intelligence is in the brain. But now things are changing. The last few years, there is a whole area called embodied cognition that says intelligence is not in the brain. Intelligence is actually spread across the whole body. And can you actually now get the intelligence of the body to actually now solve, design, design interventions? Now, for example, I know that one of the best design firms in the world actually says one of the greatest designs they have created is the mouse for the Apple iPad, and is regarded as one of the greatest design artifacts. Now, did Steve Jobs end there? But I think Steve Jobs, he said he's so intuitively brilliant. He doesn't want people to embodied cognition and all that. But I'm sure he's intuitively so brilliant. He said there is intelligence in other parts of this one across. And what did he say? He says, I think I'll create a product which is be brilliant if I can actually get the intelligence of the fingers to do the trick. And that's what he did with iPad. The whole whatever the touch screen, this one has just revolutionized things. But what does he actually use? A lot of people think it is actually the touch screen. No, he realized the fingers are one of the most versatile and one of the most intelligent machines that is ever available on the face of the earth. And can I use this effectively to make my product interact? Now, for example, in the 90s, 90s or even early 2000s, I worked with one of the largest consumer electronics company in the world. They used to make such brilliant televisions, very high profile televisions. So people used to buy and televisions come home. And then people don't even open this one because they don't know how to connect. They don't know how to open, nothing. Then we said, okay, let's work the brochures. Now it's not working. Then the sales engineer comes. He connects it. Then he says, okay, this is how you switch it on. This is how you move channels. This is how you do it. Because it was such a sophisticated and wonderful thing around there. That is when super technology and interface was created. Now, I'm sure this man called Steve Jobs said, well, there is inherent intelligence on our, the most sophisticated, interface that we have, which is our human, fingers. And he said, let's create a technology and that uses this effectively. So here he's using the intelligence, not of what is residing in human brain, as what I showed you, what Final Mile and has done, but Steve Jobs type of people have moved in and understood the intelligence of the brain and they started using it. Now, I have a friend of mine who says, Biju, there's a lot of intelligence in the design of the, in the nature. Now, the very fractal design that is out there, and I'm sure there are other constructs of design out there. And now the point is, yeah, the human brain is, and this has been about 600 million years. Now the nature has been there for billions of years. And there are a lot of principles of design. There's a lot of intelligence in the very construction of the nature. And if you go down there and understand that intelligence and bring that into our thing that we're designing, there's no doubt about it, because evolution is such a purifying and evolving to the better things. And now, how do we use that intelligence that evolved over billions of years, or at least millions of years, and then bring it onto our design tables, is where we would actually use real designs. But to begin with, I would exhort all you designers actually to just step into the streets of this country. Because one of the things I realized is, you might think, these are all poor people who know, what do they know about it? Now, let me ask a question to you. Now, who do you think makes more money? The lady on the left, the extreme left, Is it the little girl in the middle, or is it the person on the right side? I know most of you might say it's the kid on the extreme right that makes a lot of money. And you can do this research also. You can do that because it's a big business. It's worth crores of rupees. So it's worth studying what works there because it's emotionally very high, whatever. Now, my kids who worked with me and I got them to study, and what we found is the lady on the left who's actually making much more money. You know why? There is a brilliant design intervention that she has brought to her job. And what is it? It's that empty milk bottle that is in her hand. Now, I don't know who was the design consultant for her or the whole beggar, business people. But somewhere they said that you hold an empty milk bottle in the hand and people then suddenly see, the barrenness or not able to feed my child, or it's the ultimate this of not being a woman. It's the lowest point of a woman, and that has been in using a design artifact has been so brilliantly put in front of me, and almost always my chance of my hand going into the purse becomes very, very high. So all that I want to mention is, I know all of you are saying yes, designers. Design is all about understanding the human being who's at the center of it. I think I would exhort you, the best understanding of human behavior comes from neuroscience, understanding the brain, understanding some of these, what I call rules that have been evolving and been written in the brain over the last 600 million years. The more you understand that and the more you bring it in there, things are going to be brilliant. And if you want to be a Steve Jobs, try to also get the intelligence of the body itself and the whole, the facet of embodied cognition, bring it onto your design. If you want to even go beyond Steve Jobs, then there is a lot of design intelligence that is out there in the design of the nature. Bring it in. But as a first step, what I would do is get out of your classrooms as often as possible. Or even after, when you start working, my big exhortation would be get out of the AC offices that you will be working on. Spend a lot of time in the streets of India, because therein you will actually see some of the best design artifacts, which actually are persuading people one way or the other, right or wrong, doesn't matter. But that's when you realize the organized religion, the political parties, the terrorist organizations, the beggars on the street are some of the best persuaders of human behavior as compared to the so-called advertising agencies and design firms and corporates of the world. So my exhortation is, yes, that's a different path from what you've heard so far. But I can tell you in the last 18 years, first 18 years of my life, I walked the normal broad path with all the ad agencies in this country. But the last almost 14 years, I walked a different path. And I knew I'm taking a path that is different. But last 14 years have been so brilliant. I just enjoyed that particular journey. It's so much fun, so much of learning, and learn everything every day. So all you brilliant students and faculty members of NID, I know you guys are really brilliant. I've worked with a lot of you. I know your intuitive wisdom, but it's an exhortation to understand the consumer, human beings a bit more than what it is. And I just understand the intelligence, the brain intelligence, understand the body intelligence, understand the nature's intelligence. And the more you understand these and then bring it onto your design artifacts, I'm sure you will be a brilliant designer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biju. Thank you so much. So now I would like to officially open it to the house to put out the questions. And while we do so, I myself want to ask you a question, and I'd like Varun or Ria to put the answer down in the chat box if possible. So my question is, we have talked a lot about, like you told us a lot about the importance of neuroscience and research around human behavior when it comes to design. But speaking as a young designer, sometimes the jargons that are related to as intensive scientific space like neuroscience can like ward off me from studying it. So if I can put it in these terms, that neuroscience for dummies, what are the top 5 books that you will recommend somebody who is getting into studying human behavior and neuroscience as a designer?
The book that changed my life the first is by a person by name V.S. Ramachandran. He's actually India government has given him Padma Bhushan. He's the head of neuroscience of California, San Diego University. This is someone photocopied this book and gave it to me in 1999. And this book has been there. You're right. Otherwise, most of the books in neuroscience I've seen has been too difficult to read. Please read Ramachandran or listen to him. You might see another thick mush South Indian accented guy, similar. And someone told me, Biju, you sound like Ramachandran. I said, wow, what an honor. But when you read this book, you suddenly realize, why does Nataraja statue look the way it is? Why does our this one have certain features of them are much bigger and played up? So you'll find some very, very normal things that we took for granted. I think he starts explaining it beautifully. But this book is all about one of the most intriguing neuroscience problems that he encountered. Because there was a young man who lost his left arm about 23 years back in a motorcycle accident. But 23 years later, he comes to Ramachandran and says, sir, my left arm is paining. My thumbs are getting stuck. And anyone would have said, hey, what the hell is that, man? You lost your arm 23 years back. How can it pain? And then he goes on to this book will explain why is it so. Although that arm is gone 23 years back, the pain that is on the arm is actually true. It is not faking. So, and such and more intriguing things about, someone said, I spotted a UFO landing. You said, you're mad. No. And you'll see very intriguing facets about it. Or someone says, yeah, and that person had an accident and he says he can't see. He cannot see. So I'm holding my pen and said, is it a pen or, or is it a, whatever, pencil? And the person actually goes and grabs it. So the person who said, I can't see, and he can't see, but how did he manage to come and grab purposely the pen in my hand and more? It's a beautiful book, extremely well written. And you can read more about it in V.S. Ramachandran. That'll be the first book I would recommend you to start reading about the brain. And then you can get more and more deeper into other books, which I can recommend to you as you go along.
Thank you so much. I'll see if we have questions. So I remember you talked about increasing the task difficulty to increase the understanding of the risk. So my question is a little broad. I want to ask, how do we draw a line while we are doing that intervention, that the intervention itself does not become a risk factor? For example, we talked about the speed breaker example. How do we make sure that the speed breaker itself does not become a reason for an accident? So how do we inculcate that kind of an understanding in us as designers?
First of all, if you see the actual design of a speed breaker, it is never the way the created a lot of roads. It's actually much more broader. The height is perfect. There's actually a lot of thought has gone into whoever has designed it. A lot of speed breakers today are designed in a very unscientific way by some contractor who just makes and puts some cement and makes it into a mold. Now, that's not what we're looking at. We are looking at, obviously, the speed breaker, the way National NHRI has actually designed. But all that we told them is that what was a parallel, we said, now change it by 21 degrees. Of course, we know because of that, we are not going to increase the accidents. It was fairly very clear. We also observed that once we initially did it to see what is really happening out there. So again, a lot of video recording before and after was done. So obviously, what we do should not lead to more accidents. We are all trying to reduce accidents. So that's something we should definitely keep in mind, and we did keep in mind.
Thank you. There are questions coming in. So before I go ahead with my own question, I'd like to read one of them. So Manan tells that, thank you so much, Biju. Always a pleasure to listen to you. And his question goes as follows. As beginners in neuroscience or cognitive science and experienced candidates in design thinking, which of the design approaches or methods or frameworks can we start rethinking about and modifying? An example would be great. Thank you, Manan, for the question.
See, at times I sound a bit arrogant when I say that some of these are new ways of looking at understanding human behavior. I won't say read this, and you need to look at it, but our traditional way of human-centric design involved was a bit too peripheral. We just go and spend, speak to 2-3 people, whatever, and then do that. But what I found in NID when I interacted with you guys yesterday and today is obviously you are improving on that. There's a much more deeper analysis. But as you said, I was still pushing you further because none of it I still asked you to get into neuroscience of it. And in all of them, you also found that although you did the good job, the insight, you were still not capturing it. So there are even more facets have to be created into your human behavior understanding, the NID curriculum itself. That is where I would actually work a lot more. And then when it comes to the design part of it, I think that design ideally should work at a non-conscious level. Where all these interventions that I showed you were all mostly working at a non-conscious level. I think that language and that has to be created anew, because there's still a lot of solutions, design solutions we create are, objects in the mirror are closer than would appear, or danger, ahead. Please slow down. Very conscious designs or very conscious things are being created. To me, that has to fundamentally change. That conscious approach to design intervention that just speak to your consciousness doesn't work, should change. If you look at Apple, for example, it's a 2 or 2.5-year-old. There's no product brochure. The kid intuitively plays around with the fingers and figures out what to do and what not to do. That just happens because the designer has figured out the intuitive construct of the brain there with no major instructions, no major this one there. Intuitively, they're able to learn. That sort of is what we need to do. It's not one line that is written out there which is going to work. So both at the understanding of the consumer and on the design, which was to me is a bit too peripheral, and we don't get out of the AC rooms and we don't do much of it. For example, I did mention to your team yesterday the traditional methodology. Okay, understanding consumer, give it to a research agency. Now, one of the first things we did in Final Mile is research will not be given to a research agency, because that is too, the person who's designing it and working on the strategy, they will go to the field. They will go to the toilet or whatever. They will see the people shitting early in the morning at 4 o'clock, and then they will go and design. So the design research is always done by the team that is working on it. So there is a whole area out there. It has to change. The other is this conscious, the community designing has to change. And consciously, we should know there is a very deep, non-conscious, emotional facet to human behavior. And how do we appeal to that design is what we need to work towards.
Thank you. I quickly take the next question, because we have a lot of questions coming in. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the next question comes from, I guess it's from Abhimanyu, and he asks, what can neuroscience learn from Indian psychology or spiritual learnings originating from India?
To me, I believe our understanding of neuroscience will actually come from India, not so much from Indian psychology, Indian philosophy. Because as I said, the brain is the most complex system in the world. There are about 86 billion neurons, each of them having about 1,000 to 10,000, this one. So we're talking about trillions of connections between our ears. If it is purely just the brain intelligence alone, then you have the intelligence around your body and your, this one there. But even then, the number of connections that are in the brain are more than the fundamental particles in the whole universe, which means our brain is more complex than the whole universe itself. If you look at it at 2012 or so, I think Obama administration and I think EU has said there is something called Connectome project, wherein we will figure out the huge network of this one and we'll put it onto a supercomputer. Now, that project has been shelved. And 2021, we have not even taken a rat's brain, and that to a part of the rat's brain, and that neural network has not been translated yet into a computer. It is that complex. But the point is, the Western philosophy has a way of dealing with it. And Western philosophy, which is Cartesian philosophy, says reductionism. And reductionism reduces any complex thing onto small, small things. USP theory, they start saying that each part of the brain is, has got, elements, whatever. Whereas Indian philosophy always embraces complexity. And we always embrace complexity. And that is why, like Ramachandran sort of people are doing a brilliant job of it, because we embrace complexity and we don't reduce it. And even I know when we started Final Mile in 2007, a lot of people were trying to figure out the brain using fMRI scans and all that. Those companies all folded up in about 5-6 years. Whereas we've continued, and some people like us have continued, is because we still embrace the complexity of human behavior. And we said, okay, we respect it and we'll find ways to do that. So Indian philosophy will always be a huge support to help us understand the real nature of the human brain, which is its complexity.
Thank you. So I go to the next question. Humans are not created to change. Why is that so? And what's the science behind it?
Humans are not expected to change because every human action, nothing, the brain is actually constituting 2% of our body, this one there, but it takes up 23% of the energy that we actually take up. So every time we think and the brain has to think and it burns up energy. And, and we know that any machine is created not to consume more and more energy, but any machine is created to actually consume less and less energy. The whole processing of the brain, which is involving, dancing, singing, all that, we burn up only 20 watts. Whereas a supercomputer that we create can play a chess maybe better than human beings, actually burns up 250,000 times more power than a human brain. So human brain is the most energy efficient machine in the world. So one of the things that this energy efficient machine does is, let's not think, let's do the same thing again and again. And one of the things is like cycling and others at a conscious level, I learn, but the moment I learn, I take it into my non-conscious. That means I don't think when I'm doing it. So our whole attempt is to take as many things and push it into the non-conscious so that the energy consumption while doing it is less and less. Now, where is your leg? Where is your hand? None of it has been consciously thought through. Based on your tiredness of one leg, you move to the other, this one, all of it happens at a non-conscious level. So the brain does not want to change because the brain does not want to expend energy. Because every change, anything you do actually expends energy, and brain is not keen to do that.
Just extending from this question about human brain, and since you work closely with AI, I have a question that there are a lot of speculations that AI might take over us. In like there are speculations in science fiction, we see it in media, we see it in literature, but with you being somebody who works closely around these fields, do you really think that that is possible somewhere in future? And if yes, why, and how can that be avoided?
Why should we avoid it? Because as I told you, we have a brilliant team that said, okay, earlier doctors used to look at an X-ray and said you have a tuberculosis or not. But I think Fractal's one team, Cure team, has taken learnings from almost 10 million X-rays. Now the algorithm actually can read a chest X-ray now far more accurately than what a doctor can. So it's good, no? Or we're doing the same thing for brain scans. So obviously the efficiency is of AI, wherever it can do better than what a human being can do. Why should the human being do that particular job? And my prediction is that wherever there is a repetitive job and wherever there is a lot of past data about it, in no time, they're all moving to be taken by AI. That will go. AI will take over. And if you read more about it, there is a new book that came out about 6 months called There's No Work, whatever. There's that book is there. So AI will take over a lot of these routine distance across there. So the human beings can actually focus on far more things, creative and other this one where you can actually focus upon. So I don't see any problem. It's good that AI comes in. Not because Fractal will do very well, it will continue to do very well. It's because I think our life would become better, much safer, much more productive, much more better. and companies and others like machines, and a lot of efficiency on wherever AI is coming in is very, very, very good. So why should we stop that journey at all?
Thank you. So we have question from Vivek. Thank you, Vivek, for the question. The question goes as follows. How does testing happen? Assuming behavior change takes time, is a trial and error method possible?
See, in a lot of these, interventions that I showed you so far, unlike advertising, which has to be dependent upon 6 times, people have to see it, only then it works and all that. All these interventions works the first time. So the first day we put up the posters out there, the accidents have to come down. So it's not one of those interventions, set of things where things have to be seen several times. And because remember, these are rules that were written in the brain for 600 million years, and they just get activated in no time. And by the way, if I had time, I would explain some of the best work that is happening in this area is happening in the sports field. How does a batsman, when the ball is coming towards him, how does he hit that? Now, if you look at the time, the ball reaches him in about 0.45 seconds from the hand of the bowler to him. And anyway, and when you look at it, for him to just process the ball when the hand there, it takes about 0.23 seconds. Then for him to lift the bat and then hit it, it takes about 0.22. That means the time that is available for him to choose what shot to do is about 0.01, 0.02 seconds. And sports is actually one of the areas where a lot of work is happening on the non-conscious. Please go to magazines like Nature and all that, and then you will see that. And once you realize that, you've realized that all our cricket players and all are anticipating machines. They're not processing what is coming in and then going. So there are written rules in the brain, and based on the existing rules is where they are playing. So the point here is that, so because of that, it won't take time. It all happens in milliseconds is where these stimuli would create action.
Thank you. So I go to the next question. There is a very interesting question coming from Varun. How and what are the mediums does a strategist use to make sense about the information they collect on the field when they live and experience the situation, as you said, at final mile?
Is it the media that we use for stimuli? You saw that, no? If I got it right, maybe please pardon me if I didn't get it. What media we use to communicate or create the design stimuli? And you will see that in each of them, there was a point of action. And the point of action, some of them were signages, some of them were the road itself, some of them were the toilet car door itself. So if you see, the design is inbuilt into almost the product is what we do. And even look at Apple. One of the things I realized, there's no mass media communication promoting iPad and other things. The design is now inbuilt into the product. For example, we work with EdTech companies and a lot of other things. Today, I think the role of design is to integrate design into the very the nature and the construct of the product itself. Gone are those days where what to do, how to do, and all were coming through product brochures and mass media advertising and all that. That means the usage and adoption and obviously that all is enabled through design. That has to be almost there on the product, or definitely at the point of action, as you see. Saw some of the examples that I showed you so far.
Thank you. So there's another question I'd like to go ahead with, which is, while doing user research, what people say they do is often very different from what they actually do. How can we ensure that we are trying to design based on real behaviors?
So don't ever believe what they say. Don't believe what they say. Not because they're liars, because they themselves do not know why they behave, why they did what they did. Because as I said, all our behaviors happen at a non-conscious level and we're rationalizing. So one of the best thing to do is to observe what they do and then try to make sense out of it. Now, Final Mile has obviously gone a step ahead. We have created a research methodology called EthnoLab, wherein we use gamification and ethnography and a lab situation, and wherein we put people in a decision-making mode in the actual context, and we observe them. We don't really chat with them. We chat with them after this is over. So don't listen to them. Don't even ask them questions. Spend as much time in the actual context as possible. Observe, 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 purely to start with, and then try to relate it to the behavioral science and see what the observations are making sense to you. And I did show the previous team, the seniors, what we did for the road accidents, for example, how the observations were finally converted into behavioral science principles. That's a leap that can only when you understand behavioral science. And that is where things become a bit more clearer for us.
Extending this question, when we are as designers placed in a situation which has many limitations when it comes to designing sitting afar, because right now we are in a lockdown situation, or we are not really able to access every problem statement physically and being there as observants, how do you how would you suggest that we go ahead with the most physically there possible situation, like we get the most out of observing from afar? Because
yeah, I would actually say, obviously I know this is again only temporary for a few months, part of it, but still try to see how can you get the actual context part of it. For example, I know obviously I'm going back to my advertising days when I launched Axe deodorant in '99, and and the whole understanding was what is the masturbation fantasy of Indian males. There's no way research will tell me what is what is that. No one is going to tell me that. So what did I do? There is something called Sudhir Kakar, who's a very famous psychoanalyst. He said there are mirrors in the society, which actually reflects the deeper, otherwise unsaid, whatever thing gets reflected. And I realized one of the masturbation fantasies would best come out of the male would be if I read the porn magazines. So I read the porn magazines and then looked at the story constructs of it. And then I looked at, because the whole question that was asked to me was, is the masturbation fantasy of Indian male different from that of the foreigners? So you take some of those foreign magazines and read it. So there are mirrors. So movies, these sort of stories. And I think, for example, Sudhir Kakar in his book, when he's trying to study Indian sexuality, he actually takes lots of movies in India. And then he deciphers the deeper constructs of it. So there are different ways we can still understand even, as I said, very personal things like one's sexual behavior by not by direct research, but by actually using some of these techniques like mirrors and other things. But it's an attitude. I was telling, you should actually feel, unless I'm much closer to the context, I am not feeling happy. Let me find ways. Let me find ways. You should never be sad. Oh, I know consumer. I have spoken to 5 people. That overconfidence should never be there. You should always feel inadequate. I don't know. Yeah, I think that feeling of inadequacy will still continue to force you to read more, observe more, talk to people more. That feeling of inadequacy, if you have it, that itself would drive you to find new ways to understand the consumer.
Thank you so much. So this question was by Ashi. Thank you, Ashi. I'd like to take the next question, which is put up by Arpita Agarwal. The question says, why do you think, despite knowing that the coronavirus is fatal, at its worst, are people less careful about following social distancing in public and gone back to older ways of being? What could be the behavioral trigger?
See, I'm not explaining this because for those of you, there is a column that I write in the newspaper called Mint newspaper. And on the web is Live Mint. It's a Hindustan Times, it's a business paper. I've been writing that in the last 4 years. It's called Behavior by Brain. So every fortnight, I explain things that happen in the society using my explanations of neuroscience. In the last 1.5 years or so, I would have written at least about 15 to 18 articles on corona and human behaviors around it. So if you just go to my website, you can read a lot about it. And I'm very proud of some of the observations that I had, and I've definitely given explanations to some of these issues. So I would request you to do that, and that should be give you a good answer.
Thank you. I'd like to take the next question, which is which says, is behavior design aware of the responsibility towards evolutionary change, not just for humans, but for the planet too? We are really designing for our future here. So
Yeah, I
thank you.
think I hope I got it. I think we should be responsible. There's no doubt about it. I think we are designing for the future. I think we did discuss in the last session when we were discussing about plastic usage and other things and all that, how we have to be responsible about it. But we are not responsible now in our behavior. So I think designers like you should come forward to develop interventions that make people behave in a responsible way. I think that's where you guys will have a big role to play. And design has a big role to play in making all of us, behave in a responsible way. And obviously, we take into consideration the evolution of it. If you're talking about it, one of the areas I request people to understand the brain and all it is also you can learn a lot from evolutionary biology. It's a very interesting field and it's got a lot of learnings for us.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to take a question that is coming from Javed Ali. Javed, thank you. So the question goes as follows. Would there be implications from the legal point of view when a warning sign with text is replaced with a series of photos, despite it being effective in preventing accidents?
See, yeah, any change there would be an issue. I think what we found is that the NHAI, National Highway Authorities, they said let the existing one continue, and you guys put up the way, and no one actually objected to it. So much so like that baby, I don't know, I maybe you didn't see that the baby won't stop. Hyderabad police, for example, has taken that signage. Obviously, we don't charge for any of them and put it up across Hyderabad city. So, so I think people have really understood the wisdom of these. And I can tell you the government authorities, almost all of them are very, very open-minded, and mostly the politicians. I can tell you they're some of the most intuitively brilliant people that you can find. There might always be some roadblocks happening somewhere, but in our case, we've done it across 14 highways, and NHS, this one, let the existing one continue, but you guys put up what you want. As long as it doesn't create obstructions and whatever, those are, of course, are taken care. They don't have an issue about it.
Okay. So I guess we have the last question of the evening. That is by Tejas. Tejas asks, consumer behavior is a mix of human-centric thinking and an understanding of neuroscience. Whilst critical thinking can be developed over time through our practices, how do you suggest we best approach our learning towards neuroscience?
Right now, there are not too many courses, but I would request that you read as many books as possible. When I started this journey somewhere in the late 90s, there were only a few books. But I can tell you in the last few years, I can tell you, look at my bookshelf behind me. There are today very, very good books that gives you very, very good understanding of how the human brain functions. So enough content is there. What you require is that passion to understand human behavior in a new way. And once you have that passion, consuming these books becomes, fun. And I'm sure you will really enjoy it. So you can have a beer or a coffee with you, and you can still read the book and, have, your coffee and your beer along the same time. So enjoy that journey. I think that's what I would exhort you to do.
Amog has a question. I'd like to take it, although I said we have last question, but I think I should. So the question goes as, humans are known to be irrational in our actions. And even if we have millions of years of evolutionary rules hard-coded, how would you count on the users to not exercise free will and act irrationally?
Those free will and all are things that we said should be there. The human brain does not have the time nor the ability to take so much action. So irrationality, who said humans should be rational? Because we don't have time to do it. It was all thought, was generally imposed on us. We were, as I said, energy efficient machines that went about doing it. Free will. Now, I would request you to read an experiment by this person called Benjamin Libet. And Benjamin Libet found that we thought consciously I'm taking an action, but about 500 milliseconds before I thought that I've taken an action, my computer that was monitoring my non-conscious mind knew that what I was doing. Now, Benjamin Libet's work is an earth-shattering work. No one has disputed it so far, but clearly disputes the very fact of, is there anything called a free will? So there are some very intriguing, very interesting learnings when you read something on neuroscience. Be ready to burn a lot of the old knowledge you've created when you get into the world of neuroscience. That to me is the biggest issue. A lot of people are not taking it because a lot of traditional understanding of human behavior gets completely questioned. So much so that if you read a book by name Hidden Brain by Shankar Vedantam, he's a reporter of the Washington Post. And he said, this new understanding of human behavior, which has come in the last 10, 15 years, constitutes a revolution no less intriguing, perhaps more powerful than the discovery that the sun does not revolve around the earth, which basically means that there was a belief about human behavior that man is rational, conscious. That's the center of the human behavior universe. That has completely been replaced, saying that now 99.99% of the human behavior is non-conscious and deeply emotional. So the center of the human behavior universe has completely changed the last 15 years. Now you should be willing to accept that. It's almost like Earth is not the center of the human behavior universe. And so you have a new center. That's as fundamental as that. So I'm like Galileo standing and saying things are fundamentally shifted. Now, if you want to believe me, please follow me. Now, like the Catholic Church, you can put me in jail for that, but that's okay.
So much. That's a beautiful analogy, actually. So we have come to the end of the session. Before I move forward, I'd like to extremely thank you, Biju, for this was an amazing session. We got a lot of insights, and specifically people doing their systems design. It has been amazing and very valuable. I thank all the audience who have been very active, putting out really good questions, and I hope we will have more sessions to come with you. Thank you, Bate team, for helping us do this. And I especially like to thank Praveen for having arranged your visit and this beautiful session.
And thank you for being a brilliant audience. I really loved the yesterday and today's session with the system design, the team, and then very interesting questions. I hope I could answer it, but still, anyone can always be in touch with me. Praveen has my email IDs. I'll be happy to discuss whatever, share whatever little, whatever I know, and happy to share. But wish you guys all the best in your career, in your learning experience. And thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much.